And now it's time for our third forum of our national conference. And the topic couldn't be more important. And that is protecting Latino voting rights in redistricting. With the 2020 census now complete and redistricting on the top of many people's minds across this country, we have three individuals that have dedicated their lives to protecting Latino voting rights. To bring up this discussion, please help me welcome the president of the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, Lydia Camarillo.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the panel discussion on protecting Latino voting rights in redistricting. We are here at the virtual United States Hispanic Leadership Institute USHLI conference. I also want to extend a special thank you to Dr. Juan Andrade for the invitation. I am Lydia Camarillo, president of Southwest Voter and the William C. Velazquez. With us today are Thomas Saenz, and Lourdes Rosado to help us understand what is at stake this election given organized attacks on our democracy. With the U.S. Senate's failure to pass the Freedom Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, what are the challenges and opportunities we can undertake at the local level where elections are suppressing the vote that have passed, and how can we stop current voter suppression laws? The panelists, legal brilliant scholars and strategists, will share with us the lawsuits they have undertaken on this redistricting effort and those states that managed to support and draw redistricting lines that support Latino majority districts and the challenges. I'll start with Lourdes Rosado, who will be first. She is president and general counsel of the Latino Justice PRLDEV. She has more than 25 years of experience as a social justice champion, working to advance the very rights and opportunities that are at the core of Latino justice principles and mission. Skilled litigator and appellate attorney, Rosado has successfully led and directed targeted advocacy efforts on a wide variety of civil rights issues, including challenging the recession of DACA and the enactment of the Muslim travel ban, fighting dangerous conditions of confinement for youth in correctional and child welfare facilities, going after employers who expose employees to sexual harassment and a hostile workplace, defeating efforts to prevent immigrant children from enrolling in public schools, holding school districts accountable for disciplinary practices that discriminate against students based on their race, ethnicity, and disability issues, and dismantling barriers to quality healthcare, as well as educational and employment opportunities faced by people of color. Rosado completed the E. Bernard Prettyman Fellowship in Juvenile Justice at Georgetown University Law Center, from which she was awarded an LLM in trial advocacy. Rosado is a graduate of Swarthmore College, where she was a Eugene M. Lang Scholar in New York University Law School, where she was a Root Tilton's Snow Scholar. Tom Saenz is president and general counsel for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, one of the Latino advocacy organizations in the nation. Saenz leads the organization in pursuing litigation, policy advocacy, and community education to promoting the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States in the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, and voting rights. Saenz joined MALDEV in August of 2009 after 4 years on the Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Veragosa's executive team. He previously spent 12 years at MALDEV's practicing civil rights law, including 4 years as litigation director. Saenz has served as lead counsel for MALDEV in numerous cases, including challenging California Proposition 187, California Proposition 227, and California Congressional Redistricting. In 2016, Saenz argued before the United States Supreme Court in United States versus Texas, representing interveners defending Obama administration deferred action initiatives. Saenz graduated from the Yale College and Yale Law School. He is clerk before two federal judges before joining MALDEV in 1993. And I'm proud to share with you that Saenz serves on the Southwest Voter Board of Directors. With that, I'd like to have Rosado and then Saenz join us in telling us what are the issues and challenges Latinos and other communities of color face to protect their voting rights in this political climate following redistricting efforts and passage of the voting rights and restricting bills in at least 33 states. They have an open mic. I will tell them when they're going over because we're going to finish on time. But with that, let me have Ms. Rosado go first.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you all for inviting me to participate, especially with my colleague Tom. It's a pleasure. The challenges we're facing as a Latinx community is what you mentioned, Lydia, the tsunami of voter suppression laws that have been passed and are and bills that are still coming our way. I go regularly to the website of our colleagues at the Brennan Center to get the update. According to Brennan, in 2021, we had 19 states that actually enacted about 34 voter suppression laws. That came out of more than, almost 500 bills in 49 states that were proposed. And we just have more that are coming down the pike. These laws and these bills are, targeted at making it harder for Black and Brown people in this country to vote. There's no two ways around it. These are laws that make it hard to, that restrict early voting, which is really important for our community, voting by mail, even, the much talked about not even allowing people to give water to those waiting on long lines to vote. And then this past week on the federal level, of course, has been the major disappointment that you mentioned, Lydia, about where the Senate failed to pass two really important pieces of federal legislation that could have overcome some of the barriers, many of the barriers that these state level voter suppression laws are placing. This was a major defeat. So I won't lie, this is a very challenging environment. But there are things that we are doing, and we are in community with a lot of fierce organizations like MALDEF and Latino Justice, who are working to ensure that the Latino population can vote. And in a moment, I'll share some of the things that are happening, but I wanted to turn it over to my colleague Tom to add in his thoughts.
Thank you.
So Lydia, as you know, because Southwest Voter has been so integrally involved in the redistricting process going back decades, particularly in the state of Texas, this should be a year of great opportunity for our Latino community. In every redistricting round since at least 1981, the growth of the Latino community throughout the country, but in particular states, as a result of the census results causing all of our states and many localities to redraw their electoral district lines, this part of the decade has presented a chance to create new seats in Congress, state legislatures, and at local level, city council, school boards, new seats where Latinos have a chance to elect candidates of their choice. Often without Latino majority districts, that chance is taken away because so often, particularly in states like Texas, but really throughout the country, Latino voters have different choices, different preferences in voting in comparison to non-Latino populations. Therefore, we need to create Latino majority districts to ensure that our growing Latino community has a chance to elect candidates of choice. And certainly following the results of the 2020 census, which came out in August of last year in detail, those results showed that Latinos were 51% of the total population growth of the entire United States. So even though we are only 19%, that too makes us the second largest racial ethnic group in the country after whites. But even though we're only 19% of the national population, we accounted for 51% of the growth of population between 2010 and 2020. That should have led to opportunities, and it certainly will lead to opportunities to create Latino majority districts and to elect candidates of choice of the Latino community. Now, it certainly has been a struggle going back to 1981. to achieve those opportunities. It's taken litigation, it's taken advocacy, it's taken organizing to achieve every one of those victories. But it is certainly the case that in 2021 and 2022, because we are still in the middle of the redistricting process, there are still localities and some states that are finishing their process. But even from this midpoint in the redistricting process for this decade, we know that we have faced even more challenges than in prior decades. And the main reason for that is that the United States Supreme Court, in the case of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, eliminated what has been accurately characterized as one of, if not the most powerful civil rights provisions ever in federal law. This was a provision that required certain jurisdictions, including, for example, the entire state of Arizona, the entire state of Texas, and portions of California, New York, Florida, but covered a number of other states, primarily in the South. But all of these states and local areas, prior to the Shelby County decision, were required to have their electoral changes pre-reviewed before they could implement them and pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or a three-judge court in Washington, D.C. But in the Shelby County case, a majority, bare majority, 5 justices of the Supreme Court struck down the coverage formula that indicated what jurisdictions would have to pre-clear their changes. Pre-clearance covered everything related to elections, including the decennial redistricting that we're now in the middle of. That means that this is the first redistricting since Shelby County, the first redistricting where we have not had the protection of pre-review and pre-clearance by the Department of Justice. That has resulted already, we know, in deprivations of Latino majority districts that should have been drawn. MALDEF is litigating against Illinois, Texas, and Washington State right now about their state redistricting plans. In just those 3 states alone, we have seen a loss of 18 Latino majority districts. These are districts in Congress, in the state legislature, and in the Texas State Board of Education. 18 in total that should have been drawn as Latino majority districts, and in doing so would have created an opportunity for Latino voters to elect a candidate of their choice. But without pre-clearance, without a pre-review by the Department of Justice, we now have adopted plans in those 3 states that deprive our community of 18 Latino majority districts. Now, it's not only that those are 3 states where MALDEF is litigating the reason that I point them out. I also want to point out that although many on the Republican side try to argue that the Voting Rights Act is somehow a partisan tool of Democrats, in fact, it works to protect Latino and other minority voters against whoever may seek to violate those voting rights. And in this case, the state of Illinois, the map that we challenged, was put together by Democrats who are in the majority of both houses of the Illinois legislature and also hold the governor's seat. By contrast, in Texas, it's Republicans that are majorities in both houses and hold the governor's seat. Finally, in Washington state, it's a redistricting commission, an appointed redistricting commission that created the lines that we are now challenging. But that measure of 18 lost Latino majority districts is, I think, an illustration of the challenge that we face. Now, it's important to note that pending legislation that, as Lourdes mentioned, last month was defeated in the Senate, not because a majority of the senators oppose it, but because of the filibuster that requires a supermajority of 60 to move any legislation forward. And while a majority of the Senate support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, could not gain 60 votes to move it forward. But that John Lewis Act would have required all 3 of those maps, the Illinois maps, the Texas maps, and the Washington state maps, to be submitted for pre-clearance, pre-review by the Department of Justice. That would have meant a swift, quick, and cost-effective review to determine there was no intentional discrimination, to determine if there was retrogression or going backwards in the number of Latino seats, and to ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Without that preclearance mechanism, we have to go to court. And I can tell you, as we litigate these cases and with decades of experience, including with Southwest Voter as our client, at MALDEF we know, as much as we believe in civil rights litigation, that these cases are expensive, they take a long time to resolve. So we need to have that preclearance mechanism back in place. And we could achieve that through the John Lewis Act. But that loss of 18 Latino majority seats is just a fraction of the picture. As I said, we're still in the midpoint of jurisdictions drawing their lines. But when all is said and done, we know that we will see many, many more Latino majority seats that under the law should have been created that won't have been created, precisely because we don't have the protections of the John Lewis Act, precisely because the US Senate, all Republicans and actually 2 Democrats, refused to change the rules on filibuster to enable this pro-democracy law, the John Lewis Act, to move forward. I think that's an illustration, those 18 districts, what's happening with the John Lewis Act, of the kinds of issues Lourdes described that we're facing in too many states across the country.
Thank you, Tom. I want to come back to what you mentioned, Tom, but let me go back to Lourdes so we can give her equal time. I know that in Texas, since we're one of the folks that are filing the lawsuit, we're one of the plaintiff groups. There's 10 of us, although we organized about 25, 30 groups, and ultimately 10 of us sued. One of the pictures that I see is that on the congressional level, we lost 5 congressional seats, 2 that were retrogressed or set back, CD 23, which is in San Antonio to El Paso, CD 15, which is from McAllen all the way to Siding, San Antonio. And we could have gained one in Houston and in Dallas. At the end of the day, we started off with 8, given the what Texas had before the redistricting process. They took away 2, so we start with 6. And we would have had as many as 11, given what the Texas Latino Redistricting Task Force put forth with the maps that were drawn by MALDEF. So we're very, very worried about this. The other thing is, Lourdes, that given that reality that we see in Texas, and I'll come back to Tom about that, what can we do since we don't have the Shelby ruling gave us basically a blow to the possibilities of what we could do. In the last cycle, when we sued Texas, we were able to, in fact, stop the elections until we fixed it, or at least had temporary maps. We don't have that. So can you tell us what you're going through in states that you're working in? And then I'll come back to Tom to see how we can resolve what we were not able to do this cycle, at least in Texas.
All right, thanks, Lydia. So the states that we've been involved in at Latino Justice are, we've been in Florida. In Florida, we still, the maps haven't been released yet. We know that it's been a very closed process there with very little public input. But what we've seen so far is totally in line with what Tom has said. There is a trend that is diluting Latinx voting power. And when we refer to that, voting power, it means the ability of Latinos to elect a candidate of their choice, to be in a district that gives them a chance to do that. So that process is still underway. We're waiting for the maps to be released. Here in New York, we have a redistricting commission that supposedly is independent and supposedly nonpartisan, but both are misnomers because they are appointed by the legislature. And what happened here in New York State was that the Democrats on the Redistricting Commission put forth one map, and the Republicans put forth another map, a competing map. So they were never able to get together to submit a unified map to the legislature. The legislature rightfully rejected those two maps and is now working on their own. Again, we at Latino Justice are not very confident that that process is going to result in a map that's fair and equitable across for Congress and our state assembly and House seats. We at LJ, we did participate in a process with the Asian American Legal Defense Fund and the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers to produce a unity map, a map that was produced by a coalition of Asian, Black, and Latino Americans that we thought were a fair and equitable set of maps that really should be a model for the rest of the country in terms of how you approach mapping and how communities of color should work together to produce maps that uplift all of us and do not dilute the strength of one community at the expense of another, which is often what we're often pitted against each other by those who are in power. We haven't gotten any traction on that, and we've been involved in Pennsylvania where things are equally messy. And I think what we're looking at, as Tom said, is getting involved in more litigation to challenge these maps when they're finally officially released. And that litigation is messy and very expensive and time consuming, and not what we want to be spending our time on. In terms of long term, so there's no immediate, I wish there was an immediate fix, but there really isn't, short of litigating and challenging these maps as they're coming down. But I think longer term, what we have to start thinking about is what can we do on the state level to enact legislation that will have the kinds of protections that were in the Federal Voting Rights Act, the section that was struck down by the Supreme Court, that are in the John Lewis Voting Act, that is not going to get passed by our Congress because of their unwillingness, the Senate's unwillingness to bust the filibuster, as you will, to have those provisions embedded in state law. And I know here in New York State, we have our own version of the John Lewis Act that we're trying to get passed. And I think that is one very important strategy going forward.
Thank you. Tom. So I don't know if you have any suggestions on how we fight, not only in Texas, but the other states where you're litigating, given that, as you mentioned, we don't have Section 5 to protect us of the Voting Rights Act to stop the bad maps that are violating our voting rights. So what can we do in the meantime? And what are other strategies, given that in some cases, certainly in Texas, we won't be able to legislate and create new laws to fix the problem until next year. And so we lose 2022, we have then 2023, and then the possible option is, if we win in court, 2024.
Well, I think it's important to note that those who drew these lines expect the Latino community in Texas and in other parts of the country to continue to turn out at lower levels in comparison to other communities, including the white community. I think the most important thing we can do is make sure that we contradict those expectations and get out and vote at higher levels. When we turn out at higher levels, it threatens their plans, it requires them to adjust their plans, and in many cases it defeats their effort to ensure that Latinos cannot elect candidates of their choice. So the first thing that we can do is the important work that you and so many others are doing in registering voters, including, most importantly, as you know, those who are turning 18 and therefore newly eligible to vote. That's such a huge component of the Latino voting community. And once registered, making sure that folks turn out and vote. And of course, we want it to be an informed vote. And that's what else we can do. Wherever you live, wherever you work, you can work with those who vote to make sure they're aware of who has demonstrated support in the House of Representatives, in the US Senate, perhaps most important, but who has demonstrated support for protecting the voting rights of Latinos. Believe me, the defeat in the Senate last month of the John Lewis Act is entirely about the growth of the Latino community. We are viewed as a threat by one political party, mainly because that political party has not changed its views or convinced enough Latino voters to support their views, which in a democracy, that's what you're supposed to do. You're either supposed to convince people to support your view, or you're supposed to change the views you present in a legislative body to reflect those who are your constituents. So we need to make sure that as constituents and as voters, Latinos act in support of voting rights. And that means ensuring that the candidates that you support have taken steps to support the John Lewis Act and to move it forward toward adoption. If they haven't, they need to hear from you. They need to hear from you in person. They need to hear from you by phone. They need to hear from you online. And they need to hear from you in public. In other words, saying to others that you are going to vote based on who supports voting rights. As I said, it's all about the growth of our population, viewed as a threat by too many in power in Texas and in other states. So facing that threat and not wanting to change their policy views to conform to those of Latino voters and failing to convince Latino voters to change their views, their only recourse to remain in power is to prevent Latinos from exercising their full political power. And they do that by first refusing to draw these Latino majority districts warranted under the Voting Rights Act. And second, as Lourdes explained, engaging in new legislating that makes it more difficult for registered voters to cast a ballot and for new voters to register. All of those measures together are designed to prevent the Latino community, as the largest minority group in the country, from exercising its full political power because it is viewed as a threat by certain political forces in the country.
Take some water. Lourdes, I think before I ask you this question, because it struck me that we're still in the middle of redistricting and your states are in different phases. You might want to tell us what occurred in the last cycle. I remember that, well, first of all, New York once again lost one congressional district, as it did in the last cycle. I remember being at a meeting with Tom Saenz and others, and Nina Perales and others at Maldiv in San Antonio when we met with some of the leaders of PERDEV. And I know we shared with them, you're going to lose a seat, but you can create a new Latino seat, and you all did. What are the potential opportunities that you might have that in spite of losing a seat again, which Texas gained 2 seats, and as I said, instead of gaining anything, and in fact, in Texas, 3.9 million more people are part of the population growth compared to last cycle. 2 million are Latino, 39.8% of the population is white, yet they control 60% of the districts. What can we see in New York? And then we might want to start adding, because there's little we can do right now except the litigation, organize, register, and vote. What we can do is, what are some of the challenges we have given also some of the voter suppression bills? I'll come back to Tom because we sued, and Tom is Maldiv is our legal representative on Senate Bill 1 in Texas. Go ahead, Lourdes.
Oh, thanks, Lydia. Actually, I did want to mention, go back to Tom's point about the growth of the Latinx community, and when I speak with groups like this one to talk about redistricting and voter suppression, I remind them of the stats that Tom was sharing, that Hispanics were accounted for 50% of the growth of the population in this country in the last decade. And that means in many of the states that are picking up congressional seats as a result, a lot of that was fueled by Latino population growth. And in those states like New York, where we've lost a seat, and my adopted home of Pennsylvania, where we also lost a seat, the fact that we lost that seat was not because of the Latino population. And in fact, probably the Latino population growth that we did prevented us from losing more seats. So I think that's sort of a message that we have to keep putting out there, so that folks see what Tom very vividly painted, this power grab that's going on, that because those in power are threatened by our growing numbers, which should translate into growing power and influence over directing the course of our country in the coming years, that we have to shout that out, that this is what's happening. It is a power grab. As I wanted to share one, I feel like the news is so grim, and generally it is grim, and for that reason we do have to come out in power in the midterms that are coming up and in the elections coming up, because that is the only way in the short term that we can fight back, is to get our people out and to do the voter protection programs that will make sure that the most people possible in the Latino community can vote. But there was one piece of sunshine here in New York. In New York City, our city council voted to extend the right to vote in municipal elections to a group of folks, permanent residents, DACA recipients, TPS holders, a group of about 800,000 or so people here in New York City are now going to be eligible to vote in municipal elections, to choose our mayor, to choose our city council. And that was a major thing. And of course, a large percentage of those 800,000 people are people from Latin America, our colleagues in the Latino community. So already, of course, the Republican Party and Republican officials have filed a lawsuit to prevent that law from going into effect. We at Latino Justice are looking to see how we can get involved in the fight to push back that effort and preserve the law, because we know it's really important that we hear from these communities and that they get a chance to elect our local officials who control a lot of money and power, so that the community that they are living in is shaped and led by leaders who are listening to their interests. But I think that's a voting block here in New York State, that we're going to do everything I can to make sure that they have that chance to vote, because they can have enormous influence on our communities.
Thank you, Tom. A short conversation about tell us where we are with Senate Bill 1. You know that one of the things that we sued in Texas is Senate Bill 1. But we found ourselves the other day that they changed the rules from if you fill the application and you lie or you put something inadvertently that's wrong, it was a misdemeanor. Now it's a felony. So now we have no paper, they tell us. And so now we're going to figure out how we can make sure that we can register people using the so-called new application forms. But that's only one piece. So tell us very quickly, and then we're about to end. Before we end, I want you to talk about Senate Bill 1, and then I want each one of you to give me 3 things that we can do to make sure that we finish on a positive note, because you are right. The Latino community will make a difference, and these elections are the difference. So go ahead.
So SB1, as you know, Lydia, is one of the most restrictive new laws on voting. It was enacted by the Texas legislature. A number of groups, including MALDEF, are challenging SB1 because it violates existing voting rules under federal law. Some of the changes that were made make it more difficult to register, as you indicated. It has resulted inadvertently, supposedly, in a shortage of voter registration forms that accurately reflect the penalties for registering falsely. I have to say, as an aside, we know that the number of false registrations is minimal, if not non-existent. Nonetheless, they have to create new voter registration forms, and there aren't enough of those. But the other restrictions are on voter assistance, are on the ability to remotely vote, are on the ability to ensure that you're casting an informed vote. Across the board, too many provisions that make it more difficult in a state where it's already quite difficult to cast a ballot and register to vote. It's important to note that not only is that being challenged in court, but the John Lewis Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which were prevented a month ago from moving forward in the US Senate, those would protect against these kinds of laws by establishing some minimum standards for allowing people to vote remotely rather than in person, for allowing people to get the assistance they need in registration and in casting a ballot. So it's one important element of many across the country that also demonstrate that voter suppression is real and that we have to take every step to challenge it and prevent it from being implemented. Now, you asked us to end with three things. I think I already said mine, so I'll say them very quickly. We all
Okay,
need to
please.
inform ourselves, and register and vote using the information we have. But an important part of informing ourselves is informing others in the community and informing our office holders that we will hold them accountable for their lack of support if they are not supporting the voting rights of the Latino community.
Thank you. Lourdes, three things we
Thanks.
could do to conquer the world.
Yes. Yes. Have a voting plan. Make sure that check that you're registered, check where your polling site is, check it 3 times before you go out. Check the rules about early voting and mail-in voting if that's that's your plan. So that's number one, have a plan and make sure you check everything out. 2, when you go to vote, take the number of a voter protection hotline or download the app. And if you get there and you're having problems voting, contact the folks. I've been on voter protection hotlines where we've been able to resolve issues for voters on the spot on election day, and they were able to cast their ballot. So the important thing is don't leave the voting site. If you, as a last resort, make sure that you fill out a provisional ballot before you leave. And third, again, as what Tom was saying, encourage others to vote and help others vote by offering to babysit or offering to give them a ride to the voting place or whatever you can to make it possible. It is right now, it's a numbers game. We just have to get people out in numbers until we can make changes in the law and hopefully be successful in litigation in the coming years.
Well, thank you, both of you. If I may just add my 3 cents also. In 2018, 11.7 million people that are Latinos voted, compared to 2014, 6.8 million. That was almost twice as many that voted. I expect that to be the case in 2022. We must organize, mobilize. We have to go to the streets. We have to make phone calls. Just because the John Lewis Act failed this time around, it doesn't mean that it's over. We have to, part of the organizing, it has to include not only registering voters, turning them out to vote, and making sure that they're informed so they make sound voting, when they vote, they make sound decisions. But we must also continue to call each United States senator and remind them, particularly in Arizona, when 25% of the vote is Latino, we must not stop here. We must register, we must organize, and we must make sure that you remember, and we all remember, that su voto es su voz, and that an estimated 800,000 to 1 million Latinos every single year turn 18, and we must register them to vote, and they will make a difference in the states that matter. The competitive states, as you know, are Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Latinos will make that choice. California and Texas no se quedan atrás, ni New York, ni Illinois. But let's get out there and make a difference. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank all of you that are watching. And I want you to feel inspired because we have two litigators here that are going to make sure that we win in court and we win everywhere so the Latinos have a voice and representation. Gracias.